Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. We have passed over half a year into Israel's war on Gaza, a war that has further brutalized the region, traumatized entire peoples, and whose victims have left millions to mourn throughout the world. For those of us not directly living under the bombs, missing beneath the rubble, nor have bellies swollen from hunger, we are still confronted by a moral choice about whether to bear witness, to speak out, or to look away and hope that we're not confronted by our own moral failings. Knowing what is happening in Gaza is not an easy burden to bear. The poet T.S. Eliot once wrote of the First World War, "After such knowledge, what forgiveness?" While Palestinians resist settler colonial project and Zionism, they are joined by many from different backgrounds, including Jewish people. While Israel coats itself in Judaism and seeks to speak in its name, there has always been a profound resistance to Israel's actions rooted in the rich and ethical tradition and spirituality of Judaism. What can Jewish religious tradition, spiritual and ethical insights offer those with broken hearts, those in need of healing, and those who wish to resist European and Western settler colonialism? Joining me today is Hadar Cohen. Hadar, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hadar Cohen is an Arab Jewish scholar, mystic, and artist whose work focuses on multi-religious spirituality, politics, social issues, and community building. She's the co-founder of the Malachot, a spiritual skill building school teaching Jewish mysticism and direct experience of God. She teaches and consults in a variety of settings and formats, from one-on-one coaching to online group classes and in-person retreats. Her podcast, Hadar's Web, features community conversations on spirituality, healing, justice, and art. Hadar is a 10th generation Jerusalemite with lineage rooting also in Syria, Kurdistan, Iraq, and Iran. Subscribe to her Substack for access to her latest writings, offerings, and media appearances. hadarcohen.me or malachot.one and at Hadar Cohen 32, which I believe is a Twitter, I think. Hadar, but looking beyond my pronunciation there, it's Malachot, or how is that word pronounced?
Yeah, Malchut.
Ah, I was
You did.
just close, just a little bit off.
Actually, you pronounced it great. Usually people say Malchut.
Yeah, I
So,
figured the CH should be read as Ha. Am I right
exactly.
in that thinking?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, the standard literation from different languages sort of dictates how that should be pronounced. So in Arabic it'd be KH, but
Right.
for the kha. But anyway, welcome to our MEMO Conversation. We figured you would be the perfect person to have this sort of wide-ranging discussion with. Before we sort of, begin with our questions, and I'll begin our conversation, I wonder if you can sort of offer us your thoughts and reflections on where we are 8 months on into the Gaza war and where you find hope in these dark times.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. And yeah, having this conversation. It's an honor to be here. I think 8 months in, it's one of the things that's so sad and so heartbreaking is so little has changed, right? I think that it's quite enraging to see how much the world just doesn't take Palestinian pain and suffering seriously. It's almost as if it doesn't matter. And if it's, one family being killed versus 1,000 people versus 40,000, like it just doesn't register for people how intense the suffering is. And it almost feels like, we are in a time where, I mean, particularly the Israeli regime is functioning from this very machine-oriented place where there's no end to the level of destruction that it's capable of. So it's very, very scary and it's very heartbreaking. And I think that one thing that I find hope in is just how people are committed to organizing people are committed to envisioning what freedom for Palestinians can be and has to be, so often that is left out from the conversation. And at best, Palestinians are made to compromise. And I think that we are at a time where we really have to really prioritize Palestinian freedom for its own sake, right? Like, what does it look like for Palestinians to truly be free in their land? This feels like a very core question that the world has been avoiding asking, putting Palestinian people on the side, not taking them seriously. And I think these last few months have shown through a lot of organizing efforts of so many people all over the world that we can't keep doing that. We have to really understand Palestinian story, Palestinian oppression, and we really have to fight for Palestinian freedom.
Indeed, indeed. And this is, the key challenge for us confronting us today is how to get to Palestinian freedom and how to understand it, those of outside. But let's take a little bit of a step back. Now, obviously, you're somebody who's, you've got many hats, right? You're an artist, you're an activist, you're also a mystic. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about how it is you became first of all, let's say how you became an activist and what this connection to mysticism was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so I grew up in Jerusalem. My family's been there for generations. And I think, I was always a very curious child, always asking the questions. And, growing up in Jerusalem, you're really made to accept a horrifying reality that is really not normal and really violent. And somehow in Israeli society, that is seen as normative and acceptable. And, as I kind of grew older, I became so sick of what I was witnessing in my society and just the level of manipulation, invisibilization, and just complete erasure sometimes, right, of Palestinians. And I think that, I think most people who become an activist, they don't necessarily wake up one morning and they're like, I'm going to become an activist, right? But they love people who are impacted by systems of social oppression. And that motivates them to act. And I think for me, it was very, very similar. It was both through building relationships with Palestinians and understanding their experiences in a personal and relational way that made me want to participate more in activism. Now, it was also my personal lineage as well, coming from an Arab Jewish home. It was very talked about in my family, the racism that my grandparents experienced in the Israeli state and that my whole family did. That was something that was passed on to me in my lineage, is this relationship to the Ashkenazi establishment that the Israeli society was baked in, and how that really erased the Arab Jewish, the Mizrahi, the Sephardic Jewish lineages. So, for me, it was always very, very personal. And it was always about my life, too. It was about my lineage, my relationships, my community. So activism felt like a natural evolution from that, to just want better for my people. It really is what it comes down to, and I think that being in the lineage and identity that I'm in, it's very, like, in my heart, there is so much love for Jewish people and there's so much love for Palestinian people. And that love lives together in my heart. But in the reality, the reality is so, so violent and so, so oppressive. And I feel a responsibility and a commitment through my life and through my work to dismantle these systems of oppression so that love can actually, be there, and that love can be cohesive between these communities. And, in terms of Jewish mysticism, I think one of the things that happened to me in my life, because I was also part of a lot of different activism struggles, gender justice, economic justice, all sorts of struggles. And what I came to in my early 20s is that sometimes it feels like in justice-oriented communities, we just don't have enough resource to, show up for such deep, deep pain and struggle. Even though a lot of us try, there's something there that feels limited. And I started asking these questions around, well, what heals pain? Like, how do we really understand human suffering? How do we understand human pain? And to me, the answer had to be spirituality, right? Because people can be, their material conditions can shift and they can have access to resources or, all these different things. And inside, there's still a lot of suffering because the internal world is something that is quite important. So for me, it was this question around, how do we be with suffering? How do we be with pain that really led me into a spiritual path? And, coming within Jewish mysticism, my grandfather was a prayer leader in the Syrian tradition, and I always felt very connected to the devotional aspects of Judaism and the ways that it's about purifying and clarifying the channel of the heart so that we can see more clearly.
Yes, it's interesting because I feel like there's some of the key concepts you're using here, such as building the community and feeling the love. This is very directly tied to mysticism because that's obviously a core part of a lot of mystical traditions in Judaism and Islam and Christianity and many others to build. But before we sort of go into all of that, and we were going to come back also to what the Syrian tradition is, because I think that's kind of an interesting area to explore. Did you personally grow up religious, or did you acquire it as you sort of went through life?
Yeah, so I grew up religious, but there's a big distinction between Ashkenazi religion and Mizrahi Sephardic religion, especially kind of within Israeli society. Maybe people are familiar with Ashkenazi Jewish tradition. There are categories, right? Orthodox, conservative, reform, or different ways of observing Jewish law. In Mizrahi and Sephardic culture, you have this word called masorti, which means traditional, which is less rigid, I would say, and a bit more blended. So blended in terms of like the modern world and the religious world and the science world and the spiritual world. It's honoring the tradition, but not necessarily, right, feeling like sometimes what you have in the Orthodox community that is very kind of rigid according to law. That doesn't mean that law isn't important, but it's a different type. So, that's all to say that the religion that I grew up with, it wasn't something that felt that it was imposed on me and that I had to observe or believe. Like I went to an education system that really supported question asking, really supported me finding my own path, my own journey, my own relationship to God, my own relationship to Judaism. So I feel, sometimes I feel in the minority of this, but I grew up with a very, very devotional Judaism that was very accepting, that was very rooted in love, that was rooted in a close relationship to God and also to service, to love of humanity. My grandfather, he passed away when I was young, but one of the things, he was a community leader as well. And one of the things that many people would say about him is the ways that when he was praying or when he was leading, it was so evident the love of humanity that he had. And to me, that is a lineage that I inherited, is a Judaism that is rooted in a love for humanity.
Indeed, it's kind of a sort of interesting as you were sort of pointing out those differences because of course, and obviously we talk about the Ashkenazim. This, broadly you're referring here to Jews of European descent, particularly those from sort of, well, it means Germanic if we translate it literally, but those from the sort of Germany, Eastern Central Europe, and a lot of Zionism as an early political movement sprung out of these communities. It didn't spring out of Jews who come from elsewhere. And Mizrahi, we're talking broadly translated as Eastern, and refers to Jewish communities in parts of the Middle East, Central Asia, and elsewhere. And Sephardim is Spanish Jews, so those who were sort of expelled, or some may remain behind but were forcibly converted in Spain after 1492, for the benefit of our audience. But what's interesting here is that, or there's a few things, which is the Ashkenazim today are classed as the majority of Jews worldwide. Figures I've seen were like 80 to 90%, whereas 10% is 20% is Mizrahi and Sephardi. But if in the Middle Ages it was the reverse, what I read, pretty much exactly the reverse, in fact, the majority were Mizrahi or Sephardim. But when we think about Zionism as a sort of particularly Ashkenazi project, right? And this is a point that has been brought up to me by a number of people who are from Jewish backgrounds from the Arab world, that this is not an idea we would have come up with per se. I mean, it doesn't. I remember once I interviewed an Iraqi Jewish man who was in his late 70s, and he actually got expelled from Iraq. He remembers Iraq. And when he first went to Israel in the 60s, he was just shocked by the entire place because he just didn't understand. He said to me, "This is a Jewish state, but everyone here is an atheist. I don't get it. How are they Jewish?" So there's that sort of
Yeah,
experience. So
definitely. And I
this,
think, in my family, we definitely had that as well, like that kind of shock at the secularization, right? Like, I mean, Israeli society, I mean, there's so many different aspects of it right now, but it is quite wild of how much the propaganda of the Israeli regime is around Jewishness and Jewish religion. But then the practice of Israeli society from the inside is very, very around secularization. And, a lot of Jews in Israel know very little actually about Judaism. So it's always this very obnoxious, gap. And that was always something that also bothered me as someone who was very dedicated to Judaism and my tradition. I felt like there was a cheapening of that by the Israeli state. And and then sometimes it's even really hard to observe Jewish holidays in that land because of the way they're used. And the whole project just feels so cheap. And, I think that there's also that tragedy there, right? Of course, Zionism is so oppressive to Palestinian people. And Zionism completely twisted Judaism to a place where so many Jewish people are also suffering from that, of trying to connect to Judaism, trying to connect to our roots, and, having to really disentangle our Judaism from Zionism.
indeed, and it's actually quite an important point as well that you're making here, which is that externally Israel, promotes itself as the essence of Jewishness in terms of identity, but within the country, the state is itself a deeply secularizing state, and this is not an unintended consequence, it's a very much an intended consequence. I mean, I know at one point for a lot of in Jewish communities in the 1920s and 30s in Central Europe, to become a Zionist was almost synonymous with losing faith, religious faith of any kind. And another interesting fact: a lot of Israel's political leaders, particularly prime ministers, have not been believers. I mean, I think you might know more than me on this, but from the top of my head, I can only think of two that believed in God, prime ministers. And this
Yeah.
was Menachem Begin, and of course Naftali Bennett. I
Mhm.
don't know if any others.
Yeah, and I think with the Mizrahi story in particular, it didn't work outside of religion, right? Because when different Zionist agents came to convince the Jews to leave their land for Palestine, just viewing it as like a Jewish self-preservation project was not really appealing. When Mizrahi people started really being involved in Zionism is when it was painted as a religious thing. And, Mizrahi connection to Zionism was very much rooted in the religion. So, and that, that's kind of what happened with my grandparents who were Kurdish. They're from northern Iran, from Saqqez. And, when the Zionist agents came, they promised them Jerusalem, or like, come to Jerusalem. This is what you've been praying for thousands of years, and it was also centered around Jerusalem. Now, when they arrived, they were put in ma'abarot, it's called, these encampments, and they didn't actually get to Jerusalem. And that happened to a lot of people who, they were promised Jerusalem, they were promised a certain religious and spiritual connection, and then they got there and they were placed in conditions of poverty, conditions of lack of education, lack of care, lack of health, all of this, So that is a big part of also the trauma, is around having our religion used against us by other Jews, It's something that is quite intense, that level of betrayal. And then, of course, to the situation where we're in, I mean, certainly with my grandparents who came from Kurdistan, but for so many families, right? Once you arrive, you can't actually go back. You can't go back to Iraq and, to Lebanon and to all these places. Like, once you arrive, it's like certain people chose to leave and maybe then go to Europe or go to the West, or, but, and minus Morocco and maybe Tunisia, that has, a little bit of a different history. But for a lot of our places, Syria, for me also, it's like, that pain of also not being able to go back. And, as Avi Shlaim also talks about it, that it's not just a physical rupture, but it's a historical rupture as well, because it's about the history that was lost, all the stories, all the relationships. I mean, one thing I think about often is that we are living in a time, probably the first time in history, that Jews and Muslims are this segregated in terms of their living conditions, right? Jews are not part of Muslim societies in the ways that they used to be. And just how tragic that is, because we've never actually known a time in which Jews weren't part of Muslim societies. So, and I think that's where it also is important to understand that colonization has a very specific interest in dividing Jews and Muslims. That's a huge part of how colonization has been able to succeed, is that religious division. And not just between Jews and Muslims, right? We've seen that in other parts of the world as well, but pitting religions against each other is a very, very successful colonial tactic. And I think for me, especially coming from the lineage that I do, part of resistance to colonialism is also resistance to that rupture of that religious divide, and the, reviving of the solidarity that was there and the shared stories. My grandparents and my Kurdish grandparents, when they left, my grandfather would tell the stories of how, the Kurdish Muslims would mourn and they didn't want them to leave. They begged them not to leave. They're like, don't go. But, they were going as a whole community. So, we all have so many stories of loss that are so, so, so painful. And I definitely feel that pain and that heartache in my body. And, part for me of the activism around Palestine is also activism for the region and activism for a revival of, the level of shared society around religion, and that multi-religious work that feels essential. Like, there's no one religion that has dominance over the others. Like, the beauty of a region is in the shared religious discourse. That's part of what allowed religion to develop, is when we were in relationship with other religions.
Yes, it's a very important point you've made as well about the fact that, for the first time in history, effectively, Muslims and Jews are living separately in complete segregation. It's in a way, it's the sort of in sort of Central and Eastern Europe, you had things like shtetls and pale settlements where Jews were forcefully separated from wider society, and it's the importation of that model into the Middle East through colonization that we're witnessing. And it's also important as well that although Israel is has internally has a very secularizing force, there is a religious group that is quite prominent and powerful within society, which is the ultra Orthodox Jews. Who are obviously based around, again, a religious movement that emanates out of Central and Eastern Europe, which has privilege within the society. So I wonder, though, if you could tell us about the Syrian rites and the Syrian tradition here.
Yeah. So yeah, my family comes from Aleppo, and it's really actually beautiful. I feel very grateful for my family that really kept documents and kept the lineage alive, which is not something that I take for granted because, for a lot of people, not just in the Arab Jewish community, but, when your history is taken from you and erased, it's very easy to forget. And I think that's a big part of what is also happening for Arab Jews all over is that, we've lost so much of the connection to even just the understanding of what was. Sometimes our grandparents do want to talk about it and sometimes they don't, right? Like sometimes it's just like, it's too hard to talk about. And, it is sometimes really hard also to find, like on the internet, in the archives, university systems are not really teaching about us, not really in the West, definitely not really within Israeli society. I mean, the level of the educational system, what it pays attention to is mostly Ashkenazi Jewish lineage. We're not really put in the educational books in the same way. We're always like a footnote. I always joke that we're like the spices on the side, And then, of course, also in Arab societies, we're not really in the history books as well. There's also been an erasure there. So, I think that understanding lineage has really come through the ancestral line of storytelling, of oral tradition, which in some ways maybe that's how it always was. But one of the things that particularly, and with all community, right? You asked me about the Syrian community. There's the Aleppo community, there's a Damascus community, and they're actually quite different from each other, right? And they also had their own feuds and their own, ways of relating to one another. But for me, the Aleppo tradition is very much a musical one. I think it's some of the best music, really. And I feel so honored to actually be from that lineage. And, I think that there's also so much in the media around, of course, how Arabs are barbaric or uneducated or don't know what they're talking about or all that. And Mizrahim suffered from that in the Israeli state as well, right? We were told that our ways of practicing religion was backwards, that our traditions were not as elite or advanced as what was coming out of Europe. And just completely not true. I mean, Aleppo was some of the most vibrant space of multiplicity. One thing that is very, very particular to Aleppo, which is so beautiful, is that, after the exile of Spain in 1492, Jews went to so many different places, but, my family also comes from there and they were expelled and they came to Syria. And then they mixed with the, indigenous Syrians there and blended the lineage and the Jewish tradition. Aleppo is one of those places where the Ladino that was coming from Spain and then the local Arabic actually ended up being blended. And, I was recently at a talk that was talking about Syrian Jews and how, and this is exactly the family that I grew up in, is like, you grow up with like speaking 5 languages that you're not really so clear when you hear a word, like what language it's part of, right? And the way that like Ladino and Arabic and Hebrew was like blended, and the integration that happened between Sephardic culture and Syrian culture, which was very different than what was happening in North Africa, right? In North Africa, there was more of a, in Egypt, and there was much more of a separation, or a much more like lack of integration between the Sephardic folks who came and then the local Jews who lived there. So, I think there's so much in Syrian's history about this integration and this blending and this, creation of something that is so beautiful because of the multiplicity. And I think you really see that in the song tradition. I think Syrian Jewish music is some of the best Jewish music we have. There's just so much beauty there.
Yes, that's interesting. It's also interesting when you said, oh, and it's different from the Damascene one. And this has led to sort of a side question I have here, because within Syrian culture, there's always been this not just rivalry between Damascus and Aleppo, but this sense of separateness between the two. So you will find, for example, in Sunni Islam in Syria, if there's a Sunni scholar from Damascus, he publishes books. You won't be able to buy it in Aleppo. It's the one place you can't get it. And the same is true for Aleppo. He won't find it in Damascus. They've always had that separateness. Is that something similar with the Jewish community as well?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I don't know if it's that extreme, but definitely, right. Like when people were like marrying different communities, they were like, okay, we have to, like the Aleppo folks were like, we have to stay within the Aleppo tradition. And, and I think it's similar, right? Like when people ask you like where you're from or what your lineage is, you don't say Syria, you say Halabi. I say I'm Aleppo, right? Like you orient to the city and not necessarily like sometimes you'll say, right, but like it's more oriented. The city is like, is very important. But yeah, I guess that kind of rivalry energy
Um,
was there.
yeah, that's quite funny actually. But yeah. Anyway, so you were sort of telling us now, the, obviously, I think what's interesting here, if we think about Israel as a society, is that it is built around, the national identity is built around a trauma, but it's obviously a specific trauma. It's the trauma of Ashkenazim, particularly a Holocaust of the Holocaust, which of course Jews in the Arab world didn't experience. But it's also a particular reading of the Holocaust, right? It's not even the same reading of the Holocaust in most of Europe. It's a very specific one that is utilized. And I would argue that Israeli society is one which, and you saw this after October 7th, one which you live in a society where there's obviously a particular kind of narrative about the Holocaust, which is designed to tie it directly to Palestinians. So you go to Yad Vashem, there's a huge picture of the Grand Mufti in there, and so forth. And the society sort of functions in a way which is constantly sort of making that connection between Palestinians and the Holocaust. So, and it's sometimes in subtle ways. So on Holocaust Remembrance Day, you have air raid sirens to inform you that it's time for a minute silence. And it's a society that we have this trauma, and this trauma is you're constantly re-traumatized every time there's an incident. And obviously on October 7th, we saw that with, headline being the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. There's always this constant permanent re-traumatization. But if you're Jew from the Arab world, you do have a different kind of trauma, but it's a trauma that isn't recognized and is even sort of discouraged in a way. So could you perhaps talk to us about that dynamic?
Yeah, thank you for that beautiful question. And yeah, I mean, first, just to say that, right, I think that in a lot of the Israeli political imagination, Palestinians are Nazis to them, right? That's how Israeli society has been convinced to enact such violence and oppression towards Palestinians, because they have been labeled sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, but it's like all that trauma, right? That the narrative is like all the trauma that the Jews experienced in the Holocaust. Well, really, it's about Palestinians, right? And the way that Palestinians have been really made to receive that in horrifying ways. And obviously that is historically inaccurate, and it's enraging sometimes to just see how, Israeli society and Israeli leaders will have, a great time bonding with white, evangelical Christian people who are deeply anti-Semitic, who probably have more ties to Jewish oppression that actually led to Zionism than actually Palestinians and Arabs, right? So there's something super frustrating there. But to say that, for me, yeah, it's something that is quite intense, because the discourse around Palestine and Israel, when speaking about trauma, goes to the Holocaust and the Nakba. And it's the Holocaust and the Nakba, right? And these are two atrocities that my whole life I've been hearing about. And they're both, intense, not to minimize any of them, but neither of them are fully mine. I'm implicated in both of them, and both of them affect me, but they're not my story. And I think that for a lot of Mizrahim, the trauma is multiple, but one of the trauma is actually not being seen and not being recognized, not having our narrative in any way fit into the discourse. There's a trauma there, right? And I think that level of invisibilization and erasure, it's something that I've had to experience my whole life, right? Starting from coming to the West and saying I'm an Arab Jew, or even saying Middle Eastern Jew, and people are like, wow, what's that? I didn't know there were Jews from the Middle East, and just that level of ignorance, and ignorance is always the step towards racism, right? But just a level of ignorance that there is about Arab Jews and Jews from the Middle East, and then constantly having to say, yeah, and then, people take 2 seconds to think about it, and they're like, yeah, okay, of course, that makes sense that Jews were there. But just how successful that invisibilization and erasure project is absolutely shocking. And so much of my work over the years has been around really fighting that and putting us back on the map for, both for our sake, because there is so much pain in me around having my lineage be erased in that way. But also in the way where I actually think we have a lot to contribute to the discourse. And I think that we can't actually get far in understanding what's happening in Palestine and Jewish community by skipping over our histories and our struggles. Like, I just don't think it's possible. I think we actually need to understand our stories. And sometimes I actually feel like we are part of the key as well. Because, I grew up with a lot of respect and a lot of reverence for Islam. The Islamophobia that I've witnessed in Jewish community is something that feels so foreign to me through my lineage. Like, Muslims were people that were invited over for our holidays, and to a place that, in today, like, I feel whenever I host Shabbat, like, I love having Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims over, because it feels like that is what is honoring of my lineage, and exactly as you said, in Christian Europe, the Jewish community lived in shtetls and was largely separated and segregated from society. But, in the Middle East region, we had different stories, of course, and, different communities had their own things, but overall, Jews were integrated. We were the singers, we were the musicians of the whole community, not just of Jewish community. We also contributed so much to the development of Arab culture, and the level of family and connection that I feel, both with, other Palestinians, but also with other Arabs and Kurdish folks and people who are actually from my tribe. Just because they practice another religion doesn't mean we don't come from the same places and the same land. And I think that that's a question that I've had my entire life, right? Like, am I more Jewish or am I more Arab, right? Is my religion something that matters more, or is it my lineage and the land that made me? And obviously, it's not supposed to be a choice, right? Of like which matters more, but sadly, giving the reality, it constantly is. I constantly have to oscillate between Jewish community and Arab community because, right, there's not just the material apartheid that is on the land that is segregating, but there's also this relational apartheid that has completely fractured our communities. Even though, like, in my heart, I feel so much sharedness. So, I think going back also to your original question around activism, and I think like anytime you put a wall between communities and between people are going to ask questions like, why is there a wall? Like, what's happening on the other side? Like, there's no intelligence to building walls between communities. That's just going to lead to resistance. That's going to lead to people not knowing the other side and having fantasies about the other side that then become dangerous. So, for me, the work has become like, how do we hop the wall? How do we dismantle the wall? And the wall is, again, physical, but it's also relational and it's also energetic, and to me, part of the work around dismantling apartheid has to start from dismantling that relational apartheid that's been fabricated on our communities.
It's interesting when you were sort of talking about your relationship to Islam as well. And I was just thinking of the story, the person I mentioned earlier, who's Iraqi Jewish background. He was telling me a story once that he was talking to another friend who was Iraqi Jewish as well. And then his friend said to him one day, I feel like I'm a part of Islam too. And then he was a bit surprised. He's like, what are you talking about? And he goes, well, it means those who submit to the will of God. And I feel like I do that a lot. And he goes, but no, it means you're a Muslim. And he goes, what does being a Muslim have to do with it? He goes, no, that's what it means now. It doesn't mean what you think it means. And so he's like, oh, okay. So there was a little bit of that. And I think of that. But this also brings us kind of nicely to this question, which is for those of us who are not Jewish, what is it we can sort of learn from the Mizrahi and Sephardi experience? And what do you wish more people knew about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the first is that I really wish more people knew that we existed because that often feels like the first conversation is just like, wow, you're a person and you exist. Like, there's a lot of shock that a lot of people have, especially with that phrase Arab Jewish identity and lineage. But also, I mean, I want to say something about, something I've been thinking about, which is peoplehood, lineage, land, these are all kind of this material conception, but anything that's material has a consciousness oriented around it. And something I've been thinking a lot about in this struggle that we are currently in is that if we look at it through the struggle of consciousness, then a lot can be seen more clearly. And, I think for me, a huge part of my life has been this resistance to Western consciousness, and feeling the ways that it's imposed on me, in the ways that I'm made to let go, of my quote unquote Eastern ways, and just assimilate into the West and become Westerner. Of course, in the Israeli state, that was like through an Israelification process. But, also just in the world, there's a way in which like we were forced to become Westerners without our consent. And, for me, it's like, well, I actually want to remain an Easterner. I actually value the East. I actually value, our traditions and our cultures, and I want to be rooted in them, not in a way of like adding to the Western canon and, like making the Western canon a bit cooler or something like that, which is often what we're being asked. It's like, oh, add a melody here, come bring, Arab Jewish melody or an Arab Jewish food, or, we're kind of seen as this like exotic people who just have these exotic things. But how do we actually root in our own consciousness? Because for me, I feel that trying so hard to make ourselves make sense to the world is so, so painful. And I think that, and I think that feels parallel to a lot of Palestinian and Arab and Muslim struggle, which is just like, oh, like we have to come towards the West instead of the West coming towards us. And what is it like to actually, right, dismantle that? And, just a very small example of what I mean by that, I grew up in a home in which my grandfather was a Kabbalistic prayer leader and my dad was a quantum physicist. The relationship between science and spirituality was one. Science was a tool to understand God, and I think that you see that throughout so much of Arab lineage, right? Is that the way of thinking about spirituality, the way of thinking about science is so, so different than what we see in the West, which is very segregated across fields, right? There's a very big gap between the science, which is seen a lot of time as being secular, and then the religious, which is seen as a bit more, but that is just the way that the consciousness is shaped. And, I think in Arab consciousness, it's shaped totally differently. And I am really interested in what does it look like to really unleash Arab consciousness as it is, which to me includes Jews, Christians, Muslims. Like, I don't see a religious divide in Arab consciousness because I think that there's cultural ways of being. There's a way that the land informs the consciousness, regardless of the person of faith. And I think that there's so much for the world to learn from that. So I guess I would say that what I would ask for is humility from the world around understanding our region, which has been the bedrock of civilization, since the beginning of time, and has been a space of wisdom, has been a space of prophetic traditions, and that in the consciousness of the people who have inherited those lineages, we still have that. And it's just, we've been traumatized, we've been racialized, we've been divided across religions, that we haven't had a chance to really communicate what we know in our bones. And I think this is a moment where the people of the region are rising up and saying, you know what, like, we need to speak our own truth in our own way, and we need to have that platform to do that.
So now I want to sort of move us on to this question, which is to do with what you feel the sort of rich, ethical, religious, and spiritual tradition of Judaism, as well as God himself, can offer people who are downbeaten, oppressed, heartbroken, traumatized. What do you think these things can offer?
Yeah. Well, first, I'll say that one of the things that I really love about Judaism, right? Because there's a way of focusing on Jewish identity, as you said, that's very traumatizing and re-traumatizing, and like focusing about the oppression and the pain. But I focus on the creativity and the resilience that was developed through suffering, oppression, all of that. And I think that, sadly, as part of the human experience on Earth, suffering somehow also opens us up to a deeper understanding, both of ourselves and of the nature of reality. People who haven't suffered are often people who do not know about this world. And there's something there about suffering that opens us up to the mystery. And, and it makes sense, right? Because especially now when we're seeing such horrific levels of suffering in Gaza, it's like, how do we fathom that? And we can't, it's too painful for our human bodies. And this is where I feel it's so vital to call on the infinite one. God is known as the infinite one, the one who is most resourced, right? That it's a never-ending well that God is truly available to all who call onto God. And, that doesn't necessarily mean that just calling onto God makes the social problems go away, but it does help us feel this not aloneness, right? And in Islam, there's this concept as well, right? But that the earth is not really our final home. There's other worlds. And I think that there's something that is very expansive about thinking about it in that way. And then I'll also just share that, the way that I really relate to Judaism is through the prophetic tradition. We have rabbis, but we also have prophets. And prophets were people who were not afraid to both feel their feelings, like Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet because he was filled with grief. And, we have prophets who felt rage and prophets who were unafraid of the felt sense and saw that as actually a connection to God. And through that felt sense, through that actually feeling of emotions, that is what motivated them to go to the streets, right? And to say, like, this is not right, like having people suffer in this way is not right. And this is not God's way. And I think that sadly, as humans, we lose our way. We think we're serving God and we're serving religion. And then when we look at society and we see how it's built and shaped to oppress so many people, I mean, that cannot be God's world. There's a famous line, the prophet Isaiah, at the end of Yom Kippur fast. So Yom Kippur is one of the holiest days of the Jewish calendar where we fast. And it's all about repentance and returning to God. And we read this chapter in Isaiah at the end of the day, right before the fast is supposed to end. And in it, he says, "Is this the fast that I desire? Do you really think I ask of you?" Now I'm paraphrasing, but like, do you really think I ask of you to just fast when people are starving in the streets? Like, the ask is actually not just about this individualized spiritual practice, but it's actually about understanding the ways that our spirituality is rooted in how we show up for collective suffering. That other people's pain and other people's suffering is not something outside of us. It's something that we are responsible for if we choose a spiritual life. And I think especially in this moment, given the levels of starvation in Gaza, there's actually been a beautiful effort of Jewish people who have organized weekly fasts in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza around how do we actually feel it in our bodies too, right? And feel that connection and that recommitment. So I think that, and that is, part of what my tradition teaches. And then the last thing I'll say, because we were just in this holiday of Passover as well. And Passover is a holiday about miracles. And a miracle is not necessarily like a supernatural thing, but actually it's about what didn't feel possible becoming possible, right? Because sometimes we're caught in our human minds and we look at reality and we say, how can this be possible? But a miracle is something that arises and makes the impossible possible. So, I'll just say that to me is my prayer, especially when we are in this moment where it feels so impossible to, even just call for a ceasefire feels impossible, let alone, right, ending the siege, having the right of return for Palestinians, like all of this. Sometimes it feels like impossible. But this is where we call on miracles to make the impossible possible, because I don't really know what world will be left if we don't, commit to that. And I don't really know what spirituality is possible as, when we continue to invisibilize Palestinian struggle. To me, it's incongruent, especially that this is the Holy Land, that is in so many ways has so much history of the prophetic tradition. So I think we are all being called to rise up to that ask, is that how do we purify ourselves from the inside, especially of like selfishness and greed and all these things that we think, and militarization, right? Militarization, it's like we think that's going to keep us safe, but it actually just creates more harm and more suffering in the world. So how do we divest from that and actually invest in God, in spirituality, in the possibility of miracles?
And to sort of finish off on, I mean, it's really interesting, obviously, what you're saying here. It's how can you have this sort of, a kind of faith if you're not sort of invested in the world? And when you're talking about miracles, I think from our perspective, one of the big miracles seems to be America right now on campuses. It's what's surprising to us in this country is that usually the UK is where you get lots of big protests for Palestine. Obviously, every week or every 2 weekends, you will get large demonstration in London, which is massive. A miracle that at 7, 8 months in, they're still getting hundreds of thousands of people out. But we haven't seen the same thing happening at the same level at universities. And we're looking at America right now. We're seeing across the US, entire campuses are being taken over and encampments. And we're thinking the Americans are now leading, which is a kind of miracle in itself.
Yeah.
So that with that sort of obviously in that in mind, obviously we need to now think about what comes next. What radical possibilities do you think Judaism can offer those seeking to resist Zionism and the Israeli narrative, but more importantly, what it can build?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, for me, Judaism, it's so much about relationships and community. We gather every week for Shabbat, which is a Friday night dinner where we gather around and we put down our phones and we say our connection with each other matters, and we want to hear about how everybody's doing and have this moment of presence and attunement. And Shabbat is this practice of we say, it's in Hebrew, it's me'en olam haba, it's from the world to come. So it's the day of the week that we practice actually embodying the world to come. It's not something that we're waiting for. It's something it's as if it's here. And I think that practice of once a week saying, you know what, the liberated world is here and I'm going to act as if it's here is something that is quite powerful, especially when you do it your whole life. It motivates you for the rest of the week to show up, to make that world possible. This is like the 6 days of a week we work and then the seventh we rest, is part of that ratio. But I'll also say that, right now I'm working on a project. It's called Jerusalem in Exile. And this conception of exile, something that is quite profound in Judaism. And, part of the project is the relationship between Jewish exile and Palestinian exile, and how Jewish exile has been transferred onto Palestinians through, the traumatized body. But part of what, and this is how I really got into my work, because growing up in Jerusalem, in the Israeli state, there's this narrative that it's like, oh, the Jews have Jerusalem, so we're liberated, or, the exile is over. But for me, I always felt that Jerusalem herself was actually in exile because, Jerusalem is meant to be a city of God. And right now it's a racially segregated apartheid city. That's not the city of God. But also it made me understand that people put so much emphasis on the material without really investing in the internal, right? Because what does that mean for exile to be over just in the physical, but then internally there's psychological, there's mental, there's emotional exile and distress. And I think if you look at Israeli society, it's pretty clear it's an unwell society. Like these are not people who are liberated. These are people who are bound in their own prisons, and I think that the output of that, of this horrifying apartheid regime and occupation and militarization, all of that is the consequence. So for me, liberation, it can't actually just be physical. It might have to start with physical conditions, thinking about, the justice that Palestinian people deserve. But it has to continue to the inner world as well, to the psychological, to the mental, to the emotional, to the spiritual. These are all critical because we can't just gloss over them, because if we do, then we are caught in perpetuating cycles. And, that to me is what spirituality offers, is this understanding that what's happening inside actually matters. It's not irrelevant and it's not independent of external reality. And it's bidirectional, meaning that the outside world affects what's happening inside, but also what's happening inside can affect the outside world. So I think that tending to that feels part of the path of liberation. And then I'll just say to close about God, which is something that is, the whole like, it's like I'm lost for words, God makes you lose your words, but the whole purpose of my life is this intimacy and devotion to God, which is in so much the path of humility and surrender, but also the path of not knowing, right? Because if God is the infinite one, the all-knowing one, that means that what happens in any given moment is actually unknown too. Like, I don't know what will happen next. And for some people, that brings up a lot of fear and then a desire to control and a desire to manipulate. But for other people, it brings a surrender and it brings a possibility. And it brings a level of humility that makes something magnificent possible. So for me, it's like practicing that as a way of being, of making more possibilities available, as opposed to imposing the past, which is something that I find a lot that happens in the discourse, especially in the Jewish community. It's like, oh, well, we're oppressed, so we're always going to be oppressed, or we are victims, so we're always going to be victims. And this way that it's just imposing the past onto the present and not allowing the present to change and to be different. I think this is a question that we all have to ask ourselves, is that, are we willing for the present to change? Do we actually allow the present to change? Do we allow for transformation to take place? And oftentimes we find that we cling on to the past and to the mind structures as opposed to allow for possibilities of liberation in the now. So that not running away from the present, really facing it as it is and allowing the transformation that is begging to happen, that happens when we shift our narratives, when we open our hearts, when we really allow for that possibility to take place.
Hadar Cohen, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an honor to be here.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you would like to catch up with this one or previous MEMO Conversations, you can go to our website, but please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.